Hello guys, so glad you're all here and welcome back to the second half of this book review. We're reviewing / summarizing just because I feel like you can't review a book and say, oh, I liked it, it was good, if you don't talk about it. And because it's nonfiction, I'm not really giving anything away too much. The book that we're going to be talking about today, we're talking about like the second half of it again, is called The Robber Barons by Matthew Josephson. It's published in 1934. And I don't know who published it. In the Harvest Book Publishings in New York. Yeah, I didn't mention that in the last video, but if that matters to you, now you know. So, let's get started. We were in chapter 9, which is titled Mephistopheles, and that was the nickname of Jay Gould in his tactics, I believe, or it was maybe Jay Gould's father. It only says his last name right here, so that was his nickname. So it talks about Gould's tactics, blockage of the industrial system, encirclement of Union Pacific, its purchases of Gould's rival trunk lines. So Gould is now fighting with the Union Pacific railroad system, rise of the Missouri Pacific, which I believe is what the system Gould made was, and he wasn't originally a railroad guy. He was originally doing actual gold work, but then he decided to do this. Raiding the telegraph field, capture of the Western Union, seizure of the New York elevated lines, betrayal of the Cyrus Field, Gould's empire in the United States, its decline, the Great Railway Strike in 1886, the gathering of enemies near catastrophe. So at this point, the people who were working on the railway lines were having a lot of issues too, because they weren't really getting paid that well, and then a lot of them were immigrants who really didn't have a lot of other options. And the people that were living in all this new land in the West also were immigrants that didn't have a lot of options. And the people who had tried to advertise to come to America and say, oh, well, you'll have all this stuff, they didn't actually have all that stuff, and they were kind of lying or over-exaggerating because maybe they had that stuff and they just assumed that everyone could get it. Gould fought with a lot of people, and I think this actually happened in a different chapter, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to note. At one point, the way they were communicating with each other, this one group that was under attack, I think they happened maybe in this chapter because it says telegraph field, was raided. Anyhow, the telegraph lines got cut so they couldn't speak to each other by their enemies, and so they were speaking only through a messenger boy, but the rival people kidnapped their messenger boy and replaced him with someone who looked the same, and then they were able to steal all their messages. And it's just funny to me at this point that if you know you have rival businesses, you're not more careful to recognize who your messenger boy is. You just oh yeah, it's brown hair and Caucasian, yeah, that's ours. It didn't describe him, so I'm just making up a thing. But wow, that you didn't even notice that. I guess it makes sense for the mindsets of these people, but yeet. So, the chapter 10, Caesar Borgia in California. I don't know if I said his name right. The sack of California, entrenchment of the Pacific Associates, seizure of the Sierra Passes. Okay, so people were trying to get into California and out of California with railroads, and because of all the mountains in that area, I believe, there were only a few areas where you could do that. And so people were it's hard to explain this without having a drawing for you, but they were just cutting each other off with railroad lines, so then making it harder for everyone to get to there, because there were only like 2 areas you could get through that were like easy, that didn't require you to dynamite through a mountain. So people were trying to just use those passes, and there was a lot of fighting between different railroad groups. And one of them was owned by Huntington, and he was lobbying in Washington for people to let him own this pass. Triumph of the Southern Pacific monopoly, meaning he lost, and then rule of the octopus over the Pacific states. So there was a group of railroads now called the octopus, because there were a couple different railroad companies and systems together, but they were working together, not fighting as much. But even so, they were really controlling, and they could change anything at their will. They also had a lot of influence over the politicians, actually. And so when the people who were under them complained, they were just like, well, screw you, we're gonna do whatever we want because we're rich and we own the company. So the people involved in this were not having a chill time. Chapter 11, Giants of the Northwest. The Northwest open to all comers. James Hill and Henry Villard scan the field. Hill's operations in Minnesota, his technical skill and ruthlessness, rise of the Great Northern System. Henry Villard preempts the Oregon coast ships and railways, stops the westward approach of Northern Pacific, capture of Northern Pacific by the Blind Pool, its completion to the sea, sapping action of Hill, triumph and downfall of Villard, failure of popular rebellions against the railway barons. So most of that was pretty self-explanatory. I would recommend just reading the book because I don't want to give all the details away. However, they definitely had some riots, and the way that the railroad barons dealt with these riots, they actually instigated some of them just so that they would happen and then be done. There was one guy, and I think this actually happens later in the book, but he made it seem like the company was losing money so that he could lower or justify lowering the wages of these people so that they would go on strike. And then they actually had like physical, bloody, massacre-ish fighting. It wasn't a massacre, but it was like that vibe. It was not great for a while, but then people kind of acknowledged his authority after that. And so because of how violent the struggle was, it made it seem like if he gave them any kind of benefits, he was doing them a great favor, so that they were even more indebted to him. Chapter 12, certain industrialists arose. The coming of large-scale industry, the fortune of Carnegie Steel Works, his rapacity and enthusiasm, Carnegie as a business pirate, Henry Frick, Baron of Coke, his efficiency, union with Carnegie, a vertical combination. I think by vertical, they're talking about it's through different industries. So Henry Frick makes the coke. That's not cocaine, it's a specific kind of coal adjacent item that is used to imbue iron with carbon to create steel. So he was able to sell coke to Carnegie, who was then took the iron and made it into steel to make better railways. So it made it a lot more cost effective for them to work together, because that saved them both money, and then they also made a lot more money, which means kind of the same thing, but not really. Renewed campaigns of Rockefeller for monopoly, terrorism and oil, the pipeline war, and the completion of the Great Trust. And then the industrial pools, their weakness and strength, success of the meatpackers combination, the cavemen of capital. So at this point, Carnegie and Henry Frick are working together, and then they kind of are like buying up all the other people that work for them, and Rockefeller is an oil baron, and he's kind of buying up all the other oil people, and everyone else was like, oh, well, we can do that, except we'll just agree on stuff instead of buying it from each other. And so they created these pools and trusts, so it was like kind of like a union. In fact, I think it was a union too, but it was basically just like people who had the similar businesses, like all the people who made pork worked together, or one person owned them all, and so then that person had the monopoly on that specific industry. Chapter 8. Morgan and the Railways. The banker, old and new, so they're talking about the old Morgan Sr. and then Morgan Jr. Disastrous railroad financing, an appeal to the House of Morgan, Pennsylvania's squabbles with Vanderbilt, Morgan as arbiter, new disorders fomented by Harriman and others, passage of Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, conspiracy of the railway barons to nullify the act, gentlemen's agreement affected by Morgan, Morgan's drive for supreme control. So, the government was kind of getting fed up with all the people complaining about what the railways were doing, and so they kind of tried to make some laws and some acts to keep the railways in line, and the railways were like, screw you, we're gonna do whatever the hell we want. And they did. And they were able to hire a bunch of lawyers and judges and pay off politicians to make sure that they got what they wanted, and were able to just do whatever. So, nice. Chapter 9. The Robber Barons. Popular consent won by the new rich. Religious piety of the barons. Wooing of the barons by the churchmen. Conquest of the school. So at this point, they talked a little bit about the religious beliefs of some of the barons of different industries. Then they talked about how philanthropy became a thing, because these guys were earning so much money that they had to either reinvest it, or like they couldn't even spend it on things just because they had so much of it. And it's really hard for me to fathom that, just because, I don't know, I'm not poor by any means, but wow, that's just so much. Then the new gold rush to the social heights, acceptance of the pecuniary standard, merger of the parvenu Vanderbilts and the old Astors, varieties of conspicuous consumption, pursuit of titles and culture, Mr. Maecenas in the New World. So, because they had so much money and nothing to do with it, they started just doing huge, pointlessly expensive things. They built a bunch of houses. They paid people to take staircases and like the thing, I forget what it's called, but it goes along the bottom edge of walls between the wall and the floor, and sometimes in the top between the wall and the ceiling. Crowning, I want to say linoleum, but I know that's wrong. They would just like take the staircases out of places in Europe and ship them to their own houses. That just seems so extravagant. And then there was a fad for a while where every rich person needed to have an art gallery, but some people didn't actually know the difference between like art that was worth a lot of money and art that they just liked. So there was a lot of drama with fake art happening. And they threw huge, super crazy balls. And if you weren't invited to a famous matron's ball, then you were a low-down person in society. Like, it was definitely a slight specifically directed at you that you weren't allowed to come to this thing. They had one ball where everyone came on horses. Like, the entire ball, which was indoors, you attended dressed up, sitting on the back of a horse, and I think you performed dances sitting on the back of a horse. So, it's just a lot. 15? Oh, maybe I've been counting these wrong. Like I said, I'm not great with numbers. So, I think it's chapter 15, page 347. And the last one was 14, and yeah, brain farts. Sorry about that. These are going in numerical order, even though I make it sound like they're not. It's called, Again, the Robber Barons. Toward the capture of popular political institutions, Machiavellian technique of barons, indifference to parties, populist revolts of the 90s. So people were just basically paying politicians to do what they wanted at this point, and the politicians were like, okay, chill, dude, and everybody knew that that was happening. It was a lot. The superior strategy of Mark Hanna, the attitude toward labor remains medieval. They're like, what? People who work for us need rights? That's insane. What are you talking about? No, they don't. They're basically slaves. Even though we had the Civil War, though. And, yeah. Implacable resistance to unions. Jay Gould defeats the Knights of Labor. Henry Frick and the Steelworkers' Bloody Homestead. Doctrine of Divine Right of Capital. So people were, some dude, and I'm not quoting this exactly, but he was like, well, so God gave me the brains to make myself rich, therefore I believe God wants me to make myself rich. And I'm like, that's an interesting perspective, dude. And also, this is the chapter, I either mentioned it earlier in this video or in another video, where there was like an extreme bloody riot going on, and the guy in charge was just like, well, you know, it's fine. It's fine. And he kind of instigated it. Chapter 16, Concentration, the Great Trusts. 1893, Renewal of Panic, Expropriation of the Lesser Capitalists, Expansion of the Great Monopolies in Depression. They went into a little bit of a depression, and the dudes that had a lot of money and were pretty street savvy basically took advantage of everyone and made stuff even more expensive because they could. The craze for trusts after Standard Oil, framing of trusts by lawyers and bankers. So people who were in separate businesses, like they were, one person was in the steel business and one person was in the oil business or something like that, decided to make trusts where they were in a bunch of different businesses, but they all kind of worked together so that working together they would be able to make more money. And then they hired lawyers and bankers to work for them to make sure that they were using all the loopholes and couldn't actually get in trouble for it. Strength and inherent weaknesses of the trusts, consolidation of Carnegie's Steel Kingdom, the materials of conflict in steel, penetration of the Standard Oil monopoly into new industries, the money machine at 26 Broadway, the Rockefeller alliance with Harriman, preparations for final conflicts by three dominant financial groups. I said the last chapter was 16, right? So this one is 17. Bro, Roman numerals. So, my camera ran out of memory, but we were on chapter 17, The Empire of Morgan. So, it says, Morgan as an investment banker, his rule of the money trust, organization of the House of Morgan, its campaign for community of interest, its chain of industrial and railway combinations, anxieties of Carnegie, his quarrel with the disloyal Frick, Carnegie makes war upon the Morgan steel combinations, the demoralization of heavy industry. And so at this point, Morgan kind of owns pretty much everything, and the only people he doesn't own are Carnegie and Carnegie's company, and he really wants it because he just wants to have everything. And for a while he just was like, I'm not even gonna try to do that, but finally his bros convinced him to. Yeah, and eventually I believe that he did win, but it ended up being a really hard struggle. And then Chapter 18, Battle of Giants. Termination of the Steel War, purchase of Carnegie Steel Company by Morgan, formation of the United States Steel Trust, frenzied finance, expansion of Morgan Hill Combination in the Northwest, fierce opposition of Rockefeller-Harriman Group, the Northern Pacific Panic, a last battle of titans, the peace conference at the Metropolitan Club, formation of the Northern Securities Company, achievement of community of interest, Roosevelt attacks the Morgan Rockefeller Holding Company, dissolution of Northern Securities, lasting harmony, and dissimulation of the combined monopolists, the end of the tether. And that's the end of the book. And basically it just goes through the entire era of how these robber barons got their power, their backgrounds, what they did when they had their power, and eventually how they lost it again. And random fact that doesn't have anything to do with this, but I just had a casserole that had two different kinds of meatless meat in it, and I'm pretty sure that's one of the first times I've had it and not been told it, and the only reason that I knew that's what it was is because I took a bite that was a lot of meat and it tasted intensely like green peppers, which wasn't bad, just confusing. But if you are in need of a meatless meat, there is this Morningstar meat crumble. Great. Add it to pasta dishes. It's amazing because that's what I just had. And yeah, I hope you found this video interesting, and please check out this book, read it, learn cool stuff, and have a great day. Bye!